I never thought the word family could feel like a debt collector's letter. But that is exactly what it became the day my mother called and asked me for $50,000 like she was asking me to pass the salt. My name doesn't matter here, because this story could belong to any daughter who worked hard, saved carefully, and believed that love in her family was unconditional. I am 34 years old. I built my life from nothing but late nights, cheap coffee, and a stubborn refusal to give up. I grew up the older daughter in a house where my little sister was the sun and I was the shadow that made her shine brighter. I don't say that with bitterness. I said it for years like it was just a fact of nature, the way you'd say winter is cold or the sky is blue. My sister was gentle, easy to love, easy to spoil. I was the one who got things done. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone needed help moving, needed a loan, needed someone to sit in a hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, I was already there before they finished asking. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous, but steady. I built my savings brick by brick, skipping vacations, driving a car with over 180,000 miles on it, telling myself that one day all that patience would turn into something solid. A home of my own. Maybe starting a business. Maybe just the quiet safety of never having to panic over an unexpected bill again. That $50,000 wasn't just a number in a bank account. It was 6 years of my life, compressed into digits on a screen. My sister Naomi got engaged that spring. Everyone was thrilled. I was thrilled too, genuinely. She deserved happiness and her fiancé seemed kind if a little too fond of grand gestures. The wedding planning started small, a guest list here, a venue tour there. But somewhere in the following months, small turned into something enormous. Every phone call from my mother had a new update. The venue got upgraded. The florist got upgraded. The dress, the band, the photographer, all upgraded. And slowly, the excitement in my mother's voice started to carry an edge I didn't recognize at first. An edge of expectation. I remember the exact evening it started to feel wrong. I was making dinner, phone tucked between my shoulder and ear, half listening as my mother described a floral arch that cost more than my monthly rent. Then she paused, and in that particular tone she used when she wanted something without directly asking for it, she said, "You know, your sister's wedding is going to define our family's name in this town. We can't let it look small." I laughed it off. I said something like, "It's her wedding, not a business merger." My mother didn't laugh back. Looking back now, I think that was the first small hint that something in this family dynamic had shifted into a place I hadn't fully mapped yet. A shadow crossing before the storm arrives. I didn't know it yet, but the version of my family I trusted, the one where love didn't come with a price tag, was already starting to crack quietly in the background, like a glass with a hairline fracture you don't notice until it shatters in your hand. I want you to understand who I was before all of this happened, because it matters. I trusted my parents completely. I believed, the way most daughters believe, that whatever tension existed at home was just normal family friction, nothing that could ever turn into betrayal. I thought love in my family was steady, unshakable, something I never had to question. I had spent my whole adult life proving I could be relied on. I never imagined that the same people I showed up for again and again would one day look at me not as their daughter, but as a resource to be tapped. That night after the phone call, I sat on my couch and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Something felt off, but I couldn't name it. It was just a whisper of unease, easy to dismiss. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself families argue about money all the time and it means nothing deeper. I had no idea that whisper of unease was about to become a scream. Because 2 weeks later, my parents came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from me at my own kitchen table, and asked me for $50,000 like it was already mine to give away. And that was only the beginning of everything that would change between us forever. The Sunday they came to my apartment, I remember thinking how strange it was that they had called ahead. My parents never called ahead. They simply arrived, the way parents do when they still see your home as an extension of theirs. But that Sunday, my mother called that morning and said, "We need to talk about the wedding budget. As a family." The word family sat strangely in my chest, like she was reminding me of a role I hadn't agreed to play. They arrived with a folder. An actual folder, printed spreadsheets, venue contracts, catering estimates. My father, a man of few words, sat down and slid it across the table like we were finalizing a business deal. My mother did the talking. She explained, in a voice both proud and pressuring, exactly how much the wedding would cost, all the vendors they'd already put deposits on. And then, without blinking, she said the total shortfall was $50,000. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "We thought you could cover it," my mother said, like she was suggesting I pick up the check at a family dinner. "You don't have anyone depending on you. No kids, no husband. You've been saving all these years. What's it for if not for your sister's happiness?" I felt my chest tighten, that particular kind of tightening that comes not from surprise but from the slow arrival of understanding, like watching a wave rise before it crashes. I asked her carefully why they hadn't discussed the budget with Naomi and her fiancé before spending money they didn't have. My mother waved her hand like the question was beneath the conversation. "This is what family does," she said. "You've always been the strong one. We're not asking you to give it away. Think of it as an investment in the family's reputation." An investment. That word stayed with me long after they left that day. I told them I needed time to think, though even as I said it, I already knew what my answer would be. But saying no to my parents felt like standing at the edge of something I had never stood at before. In my entire life, I had never refused them anything they asked of me directly. I had bent, adjusted, sacrificed, absorbed. Refusal wasn't a muscle I had ever exercised with them. That night I called Naomi, hoping she would tell me this was a misunderstanding, that she never asked our parents to demand this from me. Instead, she sighed and said, "Mom mentioned you might help. I didn't think it would be a big deal since you have the money just sitting there." The casual way she said, "just sitting there," made something inside me go cold. My savings, 6 years of sacrifice, described like loose change in a jar. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying every version of my life where I had shown up for this family without hesitation. The years I helped pay for my father's medical bills after his surgery. The time I gave up my own apartment lease to move back home for 8 months when my parents needed help after a financial setback. The countless holidays I spent quietly paying for groceries when no one else offered. I had never once framed these things as debts they owed me. I did them out of love. But somewhere along the way, it seems my family had begun to see my love as a resource with no limit, something they could draw from indefinitely without ever asking if the well was running dry. The following week, I told my parents no. I explained calmly that I couldn't give away half a decade of savings for a wedding budget that had spiraled out of control due to decisions I wasn't part of. I offered instead a smaller, meaningful contribution, an amount that still felt generous to me. My mother's face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not sadness, something colder, calculated. "We didn't raise you to be selfish," she said. Those words cut deeper than I expected, because they weren't just an insult. They were an accusation designed to make me question the very foundation of who I believed myself to be. I left that conversation feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted, like the family I thought I knew had quietly been replaced by strangers wearing familiar faces. But what I did not know that day was that this refusal would set something into motion far bigger than a disagreement over money. Because 2 days later, my parents didn't come back to talk. They came back with 4 lawyers. I want you to imagine my confusion when I opened my apartment door on a Wednesday evening and found not just my parents, but 4 unfamiliar men in dark suits standing behind them like a small legal army assembled for battle. I actually laughed at first, thinking it was some strange joke. Then my father stepped forward and said words I will never forget. "We've spoken to legal counsel. Family loans and verbal agreements can be enforced under certain circumstances. We're prepared to pursue this formally, if we have to." I stood frozen at my own doorway while my mind scrambled to catch up. Alone. They were calling my non-existent promise a loan. There had never been an agreement. There had never been a discussion where I committed to $50,000. But somewhere in their desperation to fund an extravagant wedding they could not otherwise afford, my parents had convinced themselves, and apparently convinced 4 expensive lawyers, that my silence and my years of quiet generosity constituted a binding financial obligation. I let them into my living room because some old, deeply rooted part of me still wanted to keep peace, still wanted to believe this could be resolved like a family, not like a courtroom. One of the lawyers, a tall man with an unreadable expression, laid out documents on my coffee table. Emails I had sent over the years, casual and warm, saying things like, "Don't worry, I've got this," when helping with smaller expenses. They had gathered every kind gesture I had ever made and twisted it into evidence of a supposed pattern, a habit of financial responsibility toward the family that they now argued extended legally into this wedding. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, a slow, cold clarity replacing the warm fog of loyalty I had lived in for years. These weren't people trying to reconnect with their daughter. These were people building a case against her. My mother sat on my couch, arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes, while my father spoke in that flat, rehearsed tone people use when they've convinced themselves that manipulation is simply strategy. Naomi wasn't there. I remember noticing that immediately, the absence of my sister from this entire ambush, as if even she understood how ugly this had become and didn't want her fingerprints on it. When they finally left that night, I sat alone in the silence of my apartment for a long time. I thought about all the years I had spent believing that love in my family was simple, unconditional, safe. I thought about every dollar I had given freely and how it had somehow been quietly filed away as proof of my obligation rather than proof of my heart. I cried, not out of weakness, but out of grief for the family I thought I had, the one that apparently never really existed the way I believed. And that was the moment everything changed, because somewhere between the tears and the long hours of staring at my ceiling, something inside me hardened into resolve. I was done being the family's safety net. I was done being mistaken for an endless resource instead of a daughter who deserved to be loved without conditions. If they wanted to bring lawyers into my home, then I would meet them with something they never expected. Not anger, not desperation, just cold, careful, unshakable truth. The next morning, I called an attorney of my own, not out of aggression, but out of self-protection. I laid out every detail, every email, every conversation, and she confirmed exactly what I already suspected. There was no binding agreement, no loan, no legal obligation, just a family desperate enough to dress up entitlement as legality. But I also realized something else in that meeting. If they were willing to manufacture a legal threat over money I never promised, I needed to understand what else had been quietly manipulated behind my back over the years. That question would lead me somewhere I never expected, deep into financial records I had never thought to question, and it would reveal a betrayal far larger than one wedding budget. I began by pulling old bank statements, not because I suspected anything specific yet, but because the attorney's warning stayed with me. She said, "If they're comfortable manufacturing a debt, ask yourself what else might already be in motion." Those words sat heavy in my chest for days. It didn't take long to find the first irregularity. 3 years earlier, when I had moved back home briefly to help after my father's financial setback, I had given my parents access to a joint account, purely for convenience, so I could help pay bills directly while living there. I never fully closed that access afterward, mostly because I trusted them completely and never imagined I needed to protect myself from my own parents. What I found in the records were small, quiet withdrawals over the years, amounts modest enough to avoid suspicion individually, but staggering when added together. Almost $11,000, taken slowly, deliberately, disguised among household transactions. Not stolen in one dramatic moment, but siphoned patiently, the way someone drains a lake one bucket at a time, hopping no one notices the water disappearing. I sat with that information for 2 full days before deciding what to do with it. I wasn't interested in screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. I wanted something else. Something quiet, something undeniable. Something that would show them, without a single raised voice, that the daughter they had underestimated for years was not going to be erased by a folder of lawyers and manufactured debts. I invited my parents and my sister to a family dinner, my treat, at a restaurant instead of a private home, somewhere public enough that emotions would stay controlled. Naomi came reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable being caught between us. My parents arrived expecting, I think, a continuation of negotiations, a daughter finally softening under pressure. Instead, I brought my own folder. I laid out copies of the withdrawal records, dates, amounts, patterns, alongside a formal letter from my attorney addressing both the fabricated wedding loan claim and the unauthorized withdrawals from the joint account. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said calmly, "I know what's been happening, and I think it's time we're honest with each other in public where no one can quietly reshape the story afterward." My mother's face went pale. My father reached for the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned the numbers. Naomi looked between us, confusion turning slowly into horror as she realized what our parents had done, not just to me, but potentially setting a precedent that could one day be turned against her as well. I told them clearly that I wouldn't be pursuing criminal charges, not because I didn't have grounds to, but because some quiet part of me still hoped for a version of accountability that didn't require destroying what remained of our family entirely. But I demanded two things. First, immediate written acknowledgement that no wedding loan agreement had ever existed, effectively ending the legal threat their lawyers had constructed. Second, full repayment of the withdrawn funds, on a schedule, in writing, witnessed by my attorney. My father, to my surprise, agreed almost immediately, visibly shaken by seeing the evidence laid out so plainly. My mother resisted longer, defaulting to old patterns, accusing me of humiliating the family in public, of caring more about money than love. But for the first time in my life, her words didn't land the way they used to. I looked at her and said something I will remember saying for the rest of my life. I spent years proving my love through sacrifice. I'm done proving it through silence. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't expected. No dramatic explosion, no shouting matches captured on someone's phone. Just a slow, sobering realization within my family that the version of me they had relied on without question had finally drawn a boundary they couldn't manipulate their way around. The lawyers disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, their manufactured claim dissolving the moment real evidence entered the room. My parents repaid the withdrawn funds gradually, exactly as agreed, a small, steady act of accountability that meant more to me than any apology ever could have. Naomi's wedding still happened, smaller than originally planned, funded within the means my parents actually had rather than the fantasy they tried to build on my back. Strangely, I think it turned out more beautiful for its honesty. I attended. I smiled in the photographs. I hugged my sister and meant it, because none of this had ever been her fault, only a family system that had quietly decided my worth was measured by what I could provide rather than who I was. My relationship with my parents today is different, careful, rebuilt slowly on boundaries rather than blind trust. I still love them. I don't think love disappears simply because trust gets fractured. But I no longer confuse love with obligation, and I no longer allow silence to be mistaken for consent. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the people closest to us can sometimes see our strength not as something to admire, but as something to exploit, until the day we finally show them where our strength truly comes from. Not from what we give away, but from what we finally learn to protect. I used to think family meant giving without limits. Now I know real family respects the limits love needs to survive.